You have no right. Richard Hale's words cut sharper than the winter wind sweeping across Jackson Hole. Grace Parker stood firm, one hand steadying young Caleb as he took another fragile step on the snow-packed path. Scout, the blind German shepherd with his white cloth band, pressed protectively at the boy's side. In a flash, Richard yanked Caleb away, the shove sending Grace to the frozen ground. Snow stung her face, but as Scout whined and nudged her hand, she prayed. Certain God had placed them both here for a miracle no one could steal. Jackson Hole, Wyoming, in early February was a place where winter didn't simply arrive. It took possession. The sky was a pale metallic gray, and the air carried that dry, crystalline cold that stung the lungs. Snow blanketed the valley floor in clean white sheets, broken only by the jagged shadows of pine and spruce. The Hale family estate sat at the edge of the Gros Ventre River, a sprawling cedar and stone lodge that could have been lifted straight from an architectural magazine. Vaulted timber beams, panoramic windows, and a wraparound deck overlooking a frozen ornamental lake that had been landscaped to perfection. Today, frost traced delicate patterns across every glass pane. Grace Parker stepped carefully along the shoveled flagstone path that led toward the lakeside. At 31, she was of medium height, with an athletic build shaped by years of physically demanding work in rehabilitation centers. Her hair, a warm chestnut brown, was pulled into a loose braid that peeked out from under a knitted beanie, and her hazel eyes had that alert, patient look common to those who worked with children in pain. She had been a registered nurse and physical therapist assistant for nearly a decade, much of it in underfunded community clinics in Denver's poorer districts. Those years had made her both resilient and quietly defiant in the face of people who believed money defined capability. She had arrived here just 3 days ago, hired, after a series of brisk interviews, as the private caregiver for Caleb Hale. This morning was her first session outdoors. Beside her, shuffling with the tentative, uneven gait of someone relearning trust in his own body, was Caleb Hale. At 9 years old, he was thin and pale, with dark hair that curled at the nape of his neck and eyes so vividly blue they seemed almost unreal against the snow's reflection. An accident 2 years earlier, details Grace had not pressed for, had left his legs weak and his confidence shattered. He wore a thick navy parka, mittens, and boots that looked barely broken in. His voice, when he spoke, was soft but intelligent, the sort of tone that made you suspect he noticed more than he let on. Trotting a few paces ahead was Scout, the family's 6-year-old German shepherd. Once, he had been a certified therapy dog, but a degenerative eye disease had taken his sight. Now, he navigated the world with remarkable precision for a blind animal, guided by smell and sound, his black and tan coat still sleek, and a white cloth blindfold tied neatly around his head, more to prevent injury than for appearance. Scout carried himself with quiet dignity, though he had an uncanny way of finding Grace's side whenever Caleb wavered. They reached the edge of the lake, where the ice was dusted with fresh snow. Grace crouched, tightening the Velcro on Caleb's leg braces. "All right, 2 more steps toward me," she encouraged. Her voice was steady, calm. "Scouts, here, you're fine." Caleb nodded, jaw set in determination. He leaned forward, lifted his right foot, then his left. The movement was clumsy, but progress nonetheless. That was the moment Richard Hale appeared. At 48, Richard cut an imposing figure, tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in a charcoal overcoat that looked tailored in a New York atelier rather than bought off any rack. His hair, black-streaked with iron gray, was swept neatly back, and his eyes, a pale gray blue, had the cold clarity of a man used to closing multi-million-dollar deals. Richard was one of the most successful real estate developers in the western United States, a widower of 6 years, and a man whose reputation for precision and control extended to every aspect of his life. He valued results, not sentiment, and had little patience for methods he hadn't personally vetted. "What exactly," his voice sliced through the air like a blade of ice, "are you doing with my son?" Grace straightened slowly, still holding Caleb's forearm for balance, helping him take a few steps. Outside air, change of scenery. "You're not his physician," Richard interrupted, striding toward them, the crunch of his polished boots against snow unnervingly precise. You're here to follow the program his doctors designed. If the most highly credentialed specialists in Boston, Houston, and Los Angeles couldn't get him walking steadily, you certainly won't. Dad! Caleb's protest was a small flare in the cold. Richard ignored it. He stepped in, his presence a wall between Grace and the boy, and took Caleb by the shoulders with perhaps more force than necessary. You think, he continued, eyes narrowing at Grace, that a few months in some charity clinic makes you qualified to experiment on my son's health? That your improvisations are worth more than years of medical degrees? Grace kept her voice level. I think persistence matters, and trust. He's taking steps. Richard's laugh was short, humorless. Persistence? Trust? This is about skill, Ms. Parker. Training, discipline, all the things you lack. His tone was cutting, each word placed like a stone in a wall meant to keep her out. You were hired to supervise, to follow orders, not to take liberties. Caleb tugged at his father's sleeve, voice urgent. She helps me feel brave. Richard didn't look down. Bravery is not what you need, structure is. He tightened his grip on Caleb's arm. We're done here. Mr. Hale, Grace began, but the set of his jaw told her the conversation was over. He turned sharply, steering Caleb back toward the lodge. The boy twisted to glance over his shoulder, blue eyes meeting Grace's for a fleeting second. Apology, frustration, and something like fear mingling in his gaze. Scout whined softly, moving to stand at Grace's knee. The dog's head tilted, ears flicking toward the retreatings, figures as if memorizing their steps. Grace exhaled slowly, the cloud of her breath hanging in the frigid air. The sting she felt wasn't from the Wyoming winter, but from the familiar, corrosive judgment she'd faced before, that people like her, without the right pedigree or polished credentials, should know their place. She rested a gloved hand on Scout's neck. Guess it's just you and me for now, she murmured. The wind shifted, carrying with it the distant sound of the front door closing. Grace stood alone by the frozen lake, the snow beginning to fall again in slow, deliberate flakes. Scout pressed closer, his white blindfold stark against the deepening gray of the afternoon. The week that followed felt like living under a low, unbroken cloud. The snow in Jackson Hole didn't relent, falling in steady, windless sheets that softened the edges of everything, except the tension in the Hale household. Grace kept her sessions with Caleb indoors, mostly in the sunlit therapy room off the east wing. The space was lined with wall-to-wall windows, their sills cluttered with winter orchids, and scattered with a mixture of professional-grade rehab equipment and more personal touches. A small bookshelf of adventure stories, a basket of Scout's toys, a fleece blanket perpetually draped over the arm of the leather chair where Caleb liked to rest between exercises. Caleb was quiet in those early days after the lake incident. He obeyed her directions, followed her stretching routines, but the easy chatter they'd shared that first morning had gone. Scout seemed to sense it too, padding closer to Caleb during each exercise, his nose occasionally bumping the boy's knee as though to remind him, "You're not alone." 7 days later, the morning sun broke through the clouds, lighting the world in blinding white. Grace had coaxed Caleb into the long hallway that connected the foyer to the great room, the floors polished oak, wide enough to serve as an improvised track. Scout trotted ahead, tail swaying like a metronome. "Just to the rug," Grace said gently. "Scout's waiting for you." Caleb nodded, his gaze fixed on the shepherd's white blindfold. He took a step, then another. Then, without waiting for her signal, he started moving faster. Not smooth, not entirely balanced, but faster than she'd seen him yet. "Caleb," she began, but stopped when she saw his face. His eyes were locked ahead, his expression a mix of determination and sheer joy. Halfway down the hallway, his foot caught slightly and he pitched forward. Grace's heart seized, but he steadied himself, arms out, and kept going. By the time he reached Scout, the dog's tail was wagging furiously. Caleb bent, hugged the shepherd's neck, then turned abruptly and sprinted, as much as his body would allow, straight toward her. Grace dropped to one knee instinctively, arms opening, and Caleb barreled into her, laughing breathlessly. "I did it!" he panted. A low cough came from the archway. Richard Hale stood there, still in his suit from whatever meeting he'd had that morning, a briefcase in one hand. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes flicked from Caleb's flushed, grinning face to Grace's steady grip on his shoulders. "Dad," Caleb said, almost shy now, "I made it the whole way." Richard stepped forward, set down his briefcase with deliberate care. "I saw," he said. For a long moment, he said nothing more, simply looking at his son as if recalculating something in his mind. Then, finally, he turned to Grace. "You can continue whatever it is you're doing, but I want to be informed. No more surprises." It wasn't praise, but it wasn't dismissal either. Grace nodded. "Understood." From that day, her sessions with Caleb changed. Scout was incorporated into almost every routine. The dog's presence seemed to pull Caleb out of his own hesitation, fetching a toy down the hall so Caleb had to follow, standing patiently while the boy practiced bending to fasten the dog's harness. Grace watched the way Caleb's posture straightened when Scout was beside him, the way his confidence flickered to life. It was during one of these sessions in the great room that Victoria Hale appeared. She was Richard's younger sister by 3 years, 45, impeccably put together in a cream cashmere sweater and slim black slacks that looked tailored to her tall, willowy frame. Her dark blonde hair was pulled into a sleek twist, and her makeup was understated but flawless. Victoria had the kind of presence that made you aware she had entered a room. Not loud, but weighted, like the quiet in a gallery before someone speaks. "Charming," she said from the doorway, watching Caleb guide Scout in a slow circle around the rug. Her voice was low, almost musical, but carried an unmistakable undercurrent. "The help doubling as the entertainment." Grace straightened, offering a polite nod. "We were just finishing our morning routine." Victoria's gaze slid over her, assessing, and something like a faint smile curved her lips. "Yes, I've heard you're making progress." She took a step further into the room, the faint scent of expensive perfume preceding her. "Tell me, Ms. Parker, do you plan to stay long in Jackson Hole, or is this just a stepping stone to something more lucrative?" "I'm here for Caleb," Grace said evenly. Victoria's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Of course, you wouldn't be the first to find opportunity in my brother's generosity." Caleb's head lifted. "Aunt Victoria," she waved a hand lightly, her rings catching the winter light. "I'm only curious. Families like ours, we've learned to be careful." Scout shifted closer to Grace's side, his head turning as though to track Victoria's voice. The woman's attention flicked briefly to the dog before returning to Grace. "Enjoy your day," she said finally, and swept out as quietly as she'd come. Later that afternoon, while Grace was in the pantry gathering snacks for Caleb, she overheard 2 of the house staff, a middle-aged cook named Ellen and the younger maid, Jessica, whispering near the kitchen island. Ellen was plump, warm-faced, and brisk in her movements. Jessica was slender, with quick eyes that darted toward Grace before looking away. "Said she's got her hooks in Mr. Hale," Jessica murmured. "Victoria told me herself. Claims the woman's after the inheritance." Ellen made a non-committal noise, but didn't argue. Grace stepped into view, and both women busied themselves with unnecessary tasks. She didn't confront them, not yet, but the words settled in her stomach like stones. That evening, as she helped Caleb into bed, he seemed unusually quiet. Scout lay curled at the foot of the bed, ears twitching in dream. "They're saying things about you," Caleb said suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. Grace sat on the edge of the mattress. "People say things when they don't understand the truth," she told him. "You know why I'm here?" He nodded, eyes wide and earnest. "To help me walk." "And to see you do it," she added softly, brushing a stray curl from his forehead. "Every step you take is yours, Caleb. No one can take that away." From the hallway, the muffled sound of Richard's voice on the phone carried, short, clipped, businesslike. Grace wondered if he'd heard any of the rumors, and if so, what he believed. For now, though, she focused on the boy in front of her and the dog at his feet, determined that whatever came next, they would keep moving forward, step by step. The morning after Victoria's veiled confrontation, Jackson Hole woke under a sky the color of cold steel. The snow had stopped, leaving a crisp brightness that reflected sharply off every surface. The Hale estate looked serene from the outside, but Grace could feel the air inside tightening, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. It began quietly, a faint hum of camera shutters from somewhere beyond the front gates. Grace first noticed it while helping Caleb with his stretching in the therapy room. Scout lay nearby, his head turning toward the sound, ears flicking with alertness. "What is it?" Caleb asked. Grace shook her head, but she had already spotted a glint of sunlight off a camera lens through the trees. By noon, the whispers from the staff had sharpened, strangers lurking near the property line, lenses trained on the windows. Ellen, the cook, muttered about city vultures while kneading bread dough. The groundskeeper, Pete, a lean, weathered man in his 60s with a permanent squint from decades outdoors, warned her not to let Caleb near the garden paths. "They're camped out past the north fence," he said, waiting for something worth selling. That something arrived sooner than expected. 2 days later, as Grace led Caleb and Scout out to the back garden for a short walk, a sudden flurry of movement broke the stillness. 3 figures in heavy parkas pushed through the hedge bordering the estate. The first was a tall man with a patchy beard and a long telephoto lens, his boots crunching on the frozen ground. Behind him, a woman in a bright red down jacket held a recording device low, as if trying to be discreet. The third shorter man carried another camera and moved quickly toward the trio in the garden. "Ms. Parker, Grace, can we get a statement about your relationship with Mr. Hale?" The bearded man's voice was too loud for the quiet yard. Caleb froze, instinctively stepping closer to Grace. Scout, however, did not hesitate. With a sudden growl that startled even Grace, the German shepherd moved forward, body low, positioning himself between the intruders and his charges. Though blind, Scout seemed to navigate by sound and scent, his paws finding the frost-packed path without error. The red-jacketed woman stumbled back as he barked sharply, his tone unmistakable. "Stay away." "Back inside, Caleb," Grace said firmly, ushering the boy toward the patio door. The photographers shouted after them, flashes popping, but Scout's barking cut through the noise. Pete appeared from the side path, brandishing a snow shovel like a weapon, and the intruders retreated through the hedge with curses. The incident, however, had been enough. By evening, a grainy phone video, taken, Grace guessed, by one of the trespassers, was circulating online. It showed Scout standing protectively in front of her and Caleb, barking into the cold air, his white blindfold stark against his dark fur. The clip was shared thousands of times, the comments flooding in. "Who's the woman? Who's the kid? That dog's a hero." It didn't take long for the tabloids to seize on it. The next morning, Grace woke to find her phone, and the estate's main line, buzzing with requests for comment. A particularly vicious headline read, "Mystery Caretaker or Secret Lover. Inside the Hale Estate Scandal." The accompanying article was laced with innuendo, framing blurred photographs of her with Caleb as evidence of a hidden relationship with Richard. Richard himself summoned her to his study that afternoon. He stood by the window when she entered, hands in the pockets of a tailored navy vest, his expression more controlled than she'd expected. "Victoria," he said flatly, "hired them. I had someone trace the photographer's client list. She didn't even bother to cover her tracks." Grace's stomach turned, though she wasn't surprised. "What now?" "We counter it," Richard said. "Properly." He gestured for her to sit. "Diane Carter owes me a favor. National network, respected. She'll do an in-depth piece on Caleb, his therapy, Scout. We'll show them the truth without giving Victoria a word to twist." Diane arrived 2 days later, just as a new snowstorm began dusting the valley. She was in her early 40s, with warm brown skin, sharp almond-shaped eyes behind frameless glasses, and a calm, steady presence that seemed to settle the room. Her dark hair was pulled back into a neat bun, and she wore a long charcoal coat over tailored trousers, practical, professional, unpretentious. She greeted Grace with a handshake that was both firm and reassuring. "I'm here for facts," she said simply. The interview was conducted in the great room, the fire lit in the massive stone hearth. Caleb, bundled in a knit sweater, sat beside Scout on the rug. Diane asked questions about therapy routines, about Caleb's progress since Grace's arrival. Grace spoke plainly, her words measured. About building trust, about small victories, about how Scout's presence encouraged Caleb to push further than he realized he could. Then Diane asked, "And how do you respond to the rumors?" Grace met her gaze evenly. They're false. I'm here for Caleb and only for him. Anyone who's seen us work together knows that. The real proof came after the cameras followed them outside. Snow swirled gently as Grace guided Caleb along the cleared garden path. Scout walked on the boy's right, his head level with Caleb's hip, adjusting his pace to match the child's uneven steps. At one point, Caleb slipped slightly on a patch of ice, and Scout's body pressed subtly into his side, steadying him. The camera caught it perfectly. The trust, the connection, the unspoken teamwork between boy and dog. When the piece aired later that week, it led with that footage. The narration was simple, almost understated. In the quiet town of Jackson Hole, one boy is learning to walk again, with the help of a woman who refused to give up, and a dog who never learned the meaning of sight. The segment ended with Caleb laughing as Scout nudged a snowball toward him, Grace smiling in the background. The response was immediate. Messages of support flooded the network's social media pages. Comments praised Grace's dedication, celebrated Scout's loyalty, and, most importantly, shifted the conversation away from scandal toward admiration. Even Pete, who rarely engaged with anything beyond his groundskeeping, grunted approvingly as he passed Grace in the hall. "Good piece," he said. Victoria, however, was conspicuously absent from the estate that week. Grace suspected the silence was temporary, the pause of someone recalculating their next move. But for the moment, the truth had a foothold, and the shadows of rumor had been pushed back. The snow in Jackson Hole had turned brittle, a thin crust of ice forming over the drifts that lined the Hale Estate's drive. The sunlight was sharp, almost too bright, and Grace felt as though the entire world was under some merciless spotlight. Appropriate, perhaps, given the events of the past week. The supportive reaction to Diane Carter's piece had been a rare reprieve, but the reprieve didn't last. It arrived in the form of a thick cream envelope delivered by a courier in a navy parka. He was young, maybe mid-20s, with wind-reddened cheeks and an apologetic half-smile as he asked for her signature. "It's marked urgent," he said, handing it over. Grace shut the door against the cold before breaking the wax seal. The legal language inside was dense, but the meaning was clear enough. Petition for emergency psychological evaluation. Filed by Victoria Hale. It claimed Grace might be mentally unfit to care for a minor and requested immediate court intervention. The hearing date was set for barely a week away. Grace read it twice, pulse hammering, before making her way to Richard's study. He was at his desk, suit jacket off, white shirt sleeves rolled neatly to his elbows. When he looked up and saw the papers in her hand, his jaw tightened. "She's going for the jugular," he said flatly after skimming the first page. "It's a smear tactic. She knows the court can be swayed by perception." He set the papers down, steepling his fingers. "We'll fight it." Grace wasn't so sure. "Even if we win, the accusation will linger. She knows that too." "Then we make sure the facts are louder than her lies," Richard replied, "starting with every scrap of evidence we have on her." Over the next 2 days, the estate's tempo shifted. Richard's longtime legal counsel, Thomas Avery, arrived from Denver, a stocky man in his late 50s with thinning silver hair and a perpetual scent of cedar from his pipe tobacco. He had the calm, deliberate manner of someone who had navigated decades of ugly corporate disputes and family lawsuits alike. "Victoria thrives on intimidation," he told Grace during their first meeting in the library. "The best counter is documentation, and witnesses who don't scare easily." They worked late into the evenings, combing through security footage, correspondence, and staff statements. Pete provided a detailed account of seeing the photographers cross onto the property. Ellen described overhearing Victoria's pointed remarks about removing Grace from Caleb's life. Diane Carter, when contacted, agreed to testify to the accuracy of her interview footage if it came to it. On the third morning, just as Grace began to feel they were building a real defense, the second blow fell. She found Scout in the mudroom, lying unusually still on his blanket. His breathing was shallow, his ears limp. Panic surged through her as she knelt beside him. "Scout?" she whispered, stroking his neck. Pete appeared almost instantly, having been summoned by Ellen. "He was fine an hour ago," Pete said grimly, squatting to examine the dog. "Might have gotten into something he shouldn't have." His tone suggested he didn't believe it was an accident. The veterinarian, Dr. Hannah Price, arrived within 30 minutes. She was in her early 40s, sturdy and broad-shouldered, her brown hair pulled into a practical ponytail beneath a wool cap. She moved with brisk efficiency, running a hand along Scout's ribs and checking his gums. "Looks like mild poisoning," she said. "Good news is, it's not a lethal dose, probably ingested in the last hour. We'll flush his system." Grace felt the chill of more than winter creep over her. "Could it have been deliberate?" she asked. Hannah glanced up, eyes narrowing. "Wouldn't be the first time I've seen an animal targeted to send a message." When Richard returned that evening, his reaction was immediate. He listened to the vet's report in silence, then stood at the center of the great room, his hands curled into fists. "That's it," he said, his voice carrying more heat than Grace had ever heard. "She's crossed a line. This isn't just about you anymore. It's about Caleb and Scout and this family. I won't let her win." For the first time since Grace had known him, there was no trace of detachment in his tone, no careful measuring of words. It was as if the attack on Scout had stripped away whatever walls he'd kept between them. That night, Richard convened everyone in the library: Grace, Thomas Avery, Pete, Ellen, and even Dr. Price, who had agreed to stay for the evening to monitor Scout. "From here on," Richard said, "we treat this as a criminal matter. Every shred of evidence goes to the sheriff's department." They began assembling the dossier: copies of the legal petition, photographs of the trespassing reporters, statements from staff about Victoria's remarks and visits, medical reports from Scout's poisoning, security logs showing unauthorized entries on the property's periphery. Thomas Avery packed the growing stack into a leather briefcase. "This is more than enough to warrant an investigation," he said. "If she thought she could operate in the shadows, she's wrong." Grace sat back, exhaustion settling into her bones, but there was a strange steadiness beneath it. For weeks she had felt like the outsider, tolerated at best. Now, watching Richard hand the briefcase to Avery with a curt nod, she realized that whatever Victoria threw at them next, they'd face it as a united front. Scout, recovering on his blanket near the hearth, lifted his head and wagged his tail faintly when Caleb tiptoed in. The boy knelt beside him, whispering something Grace couldn't hear, and for a moment, the entire room seemed to exhale. The next morning, Avery delivered the dossier to the county sheriff's office. Richard stood beside Grace as they watched his SUV disappear down the drive, his voice low but certain. "She's not going to break us, not this time." And for the first time, Grace almost believed him. The thaw came slowly that year, as if winter were reluctant to give up its hold on the valley. But by late March, the snowbanks along the Hale Estates Drive had shrunk to ragged piles, and the first green shoots of grass pushed tentatively through the soil. The Gros Ventre River roared with snowmelt, its sound carrying faintly across the property like a constant whisper of change. The morning of the hearing dawned clear, the sun spilling gold over the Tetons. Grace sat in the back of Richard's black SUV as they drove into town, Caleb left behind with Ellen and a steadily recovering Scout. She wore a simple navy dress beneath her wool coat, her hair pulled back to keep her hands from fussing with it. Beside her, Richard was composed, his gaze on the road, but there was a set to his jaw that spoke of resolve rather than detachment. The courthouse in Jackson was a modest sandstone building, its steps flanked by 2 leafless aspens. Inside, the air smelled faintly of old paper and coffee. Their attorney, Thomas Avery, was already waiting near the security checkpoint, his thick briefcase in hand. "Judge Turner's on the bench today," he murmured, falling into step with them. "Fair, detail-oriented, doesn't like theatrics." Judge Elaine Turner was a woman in her early 60s with sharp cheekbones, silver hair cut into a precise bob, and eyes that seemed to take in every movement in the courtroom. She had a reputation for asking pointed questions and for delivering rulings with an almost surgical clarity. Grace had never met her before, but when the judge's gaze landed briefly on her, she sensed an appraisal that went deeper than appearance. Victoria arrived moments later, flanked by her attorney, a tall, polished man named Daniel Krell, whose slicked back dark hair and tailored charcoal suit gave him the air of someone used to working in high-stakes corporate litigation. Victoria herself was dressed in a cream skirt suit, a pearl pin at her lapel, her expression the picture of restrained indignation. The proceedings moved briskly. Krell began with the petition, his voice smooth, laying out claims of erratic decision-making and emotional instability on Grace's part. Grace sat still, her fingers clasped in her lap. As he painted a picture of a woman overstepping her role and endangering a vulnerable child, then it was Avery's turn. He spoke without embellishment, presenting security footage, staff statements, and medical reports. Ellen testified about Victoria's pointed threats. Pete described confronting trespassing photographers. Dr. Hannah Price recounted Scout's poisoning in calm, clinical detail. Each piece fit neatly into a larger pattern, one of targeted harassment and manipulation. The pivotal moment came when Diane Carter took the stand. In a tailored burgundy blazer, she testified to the accuracy of her aired segment, explaining the context of every clip shown. She spoke of Caleb's progress, of Grace's professionalism, and of Scout's therapeutic role. The judge watched intently, her pen still. When Avery rested the defense, the courtroom was quiet. Judge Turner leaned back, hands folded. "I have reviewed the evidence and testimony," she said finally. "It is clear to this court that the petition lacks merit and was filed in bad faith. Furthermore, the evidence supports the initiation of criminal proceedings for harassment and invasion of privacy against the petitioner." The words landed with a palpable weight. Victoria's expression didn't change immediately, but her knuckles whitened on the edge of the table. Krell leaned toward her, murmuring something, but the judge's gavel had already fallen. The matter was settled. Outside, the spring air felt impossibly fresh. The press had gathered along the courthouse steps, their cameras and microphones poised. Richard paused at the top step, turning toward them. "Ms. Parker has been instrumental in my son's recovery," he said, his voice carrying clearly. "I was wrong to judge her by her background instead of her character. Caleb's progress speaks for itself, and for her dedication." Grace stood beside him, the sunlight catching in her hair. For the first time since arriving in Jackson Hole, she didn't feel like a stranger on borrowed ground. In the days that followed, life in the estate shifted into a calmer rhythm. Victoria's absence was conspicuous, her name no longer a constant shadow in conversation. The thaw deepened, the garden paths clearing of ice, the ornamental lake loosening its grip on winter. One bright afternoon in early April, Caleb appeared at the back door with Scout trotting at his side, the boy's small hand wrapped around the shepherd's harness. Grace followed them out into the garden, watching as they made their way down the path, at an unhurried but steady pace. Caleb's steps were surer now, his head held higher. Scout moved in perfect sync, the white blindfold fluttering slightly in the breeze. They crossed the small wooden bridge over the stream that fed the lake, the boards creaking softly beneath their combined weight. On the other side, Caleb turned and grinned at her, not the tentative smile of the boy she'd first met, but the easy, radiant grin of someone who had reclaimed a part of himself. Richard joined them halfway across, one hand resting briefly on Caleb's shoulder, the other brushing against Scout's head. The three of them, boy, woman, and dog, stood together for a moment, framed by the shimmer of melting water and the smell of damp earth. Spring had come to Jackson Hole, and with it, the promise of something new. Even in the coldest winters of life, God can send the right people to bring warmth, healing, and hope. If you believe He still works miracles today, share this story, subscribe for more, and type Amen in the comments. May God bless you and your family.